So you know this world, you know this area. I don't know, what is top of mind for you as you've seen this roll out?
You know, it's actually been a pretty surreal day, especially for a space reporter. I mean, I've been covering SpaceX for a decade now.
Yeah.
You know, I actually heard about this company, you know, many years ago when it was kind of like catching some steam back with, you know, my parents worked for NASA. And even back then, before they retired, we're kind of picking up on this company, you know. So it's kind of been in my life for some time. And, you know, I never thought that I would see them IPO in this way, because the messaging has always been, we will not IPO until we are regularly flying people to Mars. Obviously, that is not happening. But, you know, maybe you could go back and look at the statements that they have made, that you could subjectively kind of change them to say, okay, you know, they're flying Starship regularly, so, you know, maybe that counts. But I didn't have this on my bingo card. I certainly didn't have the AI element of it on my bingo card as well.
Well,
so
I'm glad you brought that up, and I want to go into some numbers that SpaceX highlighted in its S1. 650 total launches, 85% of missions flown with one or more reused boosters. In terms of global mass to orbit last year, it was responsible for 80+% of that. It's flown 78 crew members. Yet, as we've gone back to throughout the last 2 hours, space isn't even the biggest portion of the company in terms of revenue. The name is still SpaceX, but it's also got XAI and a host of other companies. In your view, is it still as committed to space as it was back in 2002?
Oh, absolutely. I will admit, you know, when they filed their prospectus, it was an eye-poppingly low number, just how much revenue that the launch business was bringing in compared to Starlink and now this AI business that they newly acquired. I mean, they only brought in about $4 billion worth of revenue on the launch business last year as compared to something like $11 billion on the connectivity side. And AI is rapidly, you know, matching that launch business revenue. But at the same time, and I did a story about this too, you know, obviously the future of SpaceX is an AI company, but that launch that they have established is by far their biggest asset. I mean, it's going to put them in a different category when it comes to this new market of putting AI data centers into orbit. Look at, you know, Amazon, right? Amazon has to go out and buy, you know, tons of rockets just to get their Starlink competitor into orbit. So that's an added expenditure that they have to have that SpaceX doesn't quite have to have. And they can tap their rockets whenever they want to. If they get Starship up and running, they could potentially do the same thing. But, you know, there's a lot of asterisks that go along with that as well.
Yeah, and the asterisks are codified in the prospectus, right? So, you know, if you haven't been paying attention and it's brand new information to you that there's a company called SpaceX that today did the biggest IPO in history, then let me tell you about Starship. You know, basically on paper, the most powerful rocket that humankind's developed, but on paper being the operative word. And so clear in the prospectus is that if they don't get Starship not only to work, but be reusable, they can't achieve the orbital data center goals that they have. Humankind won't go to Mars, and all of the economics in between are so tied to that. And it's a simple story, which is why Loren's going to be so busy
exactly.
You know, covering each test flight that they do.
You mentioned orbital data centers almost in passing just now as sort of a foregone conclusion that they would actually not just be a pie in the sky idea, but actually be something that comes to fruition.
Yeah, I actually think the orbital data centers part of it is less of the issue for me than it is the Starship part of it. Because what we have seen with Starlink is that they can operate a massive constellation of satellites. Right now, they are the world's largest satellite operator with upwards of 10,000 satellites. You know, they're going to use the experience of developing those satellites to develop these orbital data centers. Now, granted, I do think there is going to be some engineering challenge involved, right? Those solar panels that they displayed on them are pretty massive, and they're pretty comparable to the solar panels that are on the International Space Station. But so imagine a million of those. But at the same time, you know, they have that experience. I think that gives them an advantage compared to their competitors. It's really the Starship aspect of it because they are pursuing this holy grail of spaceflight, which is full reusability. It's never been done. They're still having issues with making sure that actually happens. So I really can't put a timetable on when they're going to crack that code. Yeah. But I think what I would point out is that, you know, the numbers in their prospectus are obviously kind of odd to put to the public market, right? They're a losing company or a money losing company. But I think what they're trying to say is take the success that we've had with, bringing down launch costs, reusing rockets in the past, partially reusing. We're going to do that again. So they are confident that people will invest thinking that they can replicate that success that they've had.
And to Loren's point, the 10,000 satellites that are out there in orbit were all done by Falcon 9. So like the basics here, Starship isn't yet proven. One really fascinating bit is SpaceX is also on the hook for all these NASA missions to get America back to the moon.
Right.
So they have this like near-term pressure to start proving that the combined system, it's the shiny, pointy spacecraft on the top, the booster on the bottom. In aggregate, it's also called Starship. Get both pieces of it back landing on Earth and be reusable. And they've actually never done that. Have both pieces. They've done one piece, but one's only half the job.
And I'll also add, it's even more difficult than that. So obviously, Starship you can pack a bunch of satellites in there and get them to Earth orbit, presumably easier than it would be to go to the moon or Mars, because in order to go to these deep space destinations like the moon, like Ed was talking about, they're going to have to refuel. And I think a lot of people don't quite understand the technical challenges that is going to pose. It's going to require back to back to back flights of Starship over and over, and they'll have to dock with a depot Starship in orbit. So just imagine they put one up there, and then they send, it could be 12, it could be 15.
So they will use Starship launches to send fuel to that depot.
Yes.
Then a Starship will stop at the depot, or a vehicle rather, will stop at the depot and get refueled there.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially like filling up for gas on a long distance road trip, right? But a little more complicated than that. But it is going to require that reusability aspect of it. Otherwise, they're just not going to be able to do those back-to-back launches in an economical way, right? It'll cost them a fortune if they can't crack that.
Is it impossible?
I will never say that when it comes to SpaceX.
Is it incredibly difficult?
I think it's an engineering challenge. That's my go-to. He's
good at engineering challenges.
Absolutely. And they're not breaking any physics here, but what they are doing is a very complicated feat of engineering. But, something that Gwen Shotwell said earlier today, and they've said this before, is that, SpaceX's log line is that they take the impossible and they make it late.
And also, if it was impossible, technically impossible, we wouldn't be here.
You're right.
With the marketing of an IPO of $75 billion and the trading up 26% from the IPO price.
I love what you said about your family. My dad was very involved in early space stuff, and they were doing gyroscopes for guidance systems. That's what they were doing. But this idea of that you can have rockets go up and come back would blow his mind, and he's not with us anymore. But I think about how much he has really pushed the envelope. Having said that, if he doesn't get to Mars, but if he does somehow get data centers out in space and some of these other things, whether it's the Optimus robots and other things, or if XAI becomes this unbelievable, AI behemoth, is that enough for us to love what is ultimately maybe the Elon universe?
I'm sure there will be plenty of fans who will be satisfied with that.
Will it grow into the valuation? That stuff alone.
I'm just a lowly rocket reporter.
Sorry.
And now I'm thrust into the world of AI, and so I'm very much going to have to get much more well versed in the AI market. I do wonder though, because like I was saying earlier, this was not on my bingo card in terms of how SpaceX would IPO. I have wondered if the fans of SpaceX do ultimately want this outcome, because the original thesis of SpaceX was to start a human settlement on Mars. That seems to have taken a bit of a detour. I mean, granted, Starship obviously is supposed to be the key to unlocking that.
Yeah.
But there is this big side project that they've established with this orbital data center constellation. So, is it taking away from that original message, which has been so consistent from the beginning?
Yeah, exactly. Hey, speaking of data centers, Ed Ludlow, I don't know how you're doing it. He just doesn't speak. He's putting out stories on the terminal as we are here. He certainly can. You've got a story out here about SpaceX renting out computing after their own teams had trouble using it. This goes to some of their data centers.
Right. So we talked about SpaceX doing the deal with both Anthropic, $1.25 billion a month, and Google, $900 million and more a month to rent compute capacity. Outside of Memphis, Tennessee, there are 3 data centers: Colossus 1, the first one, and then Colossus 2 and Colossus 3. Colossus 1 is 10 miles from the Colossus 2 and Colossus 3 facilities that are right next to each other. And what sources told me was, yes, because they thought it was a smart business plan. They could make money quickly in the short term by renting out the capacity. But the internet infrastructure between Colossus 1 and the other 2 over that 10-mile range is old. So they ran into latency issues of trying to get all 3 buildings to work as a super cluster together. The second issue is that in Colossus 1, there are multiple generations of NVIDIA GPUs, whereas Colossus 2 and 3 have the absolute latest uniform Blackwell systems. You can do that, but it means that the latest chips that work much faster have to wait for the older ones to catch up, which is a bottleneck.
There's a certain irony here, given that connectivity is a segment of SpaceX, and that we're flying on airplanes.
It's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, not in the story.
Streaming video thanks to SpaceX, but for 10 mile away,
XAI and now SpaceX, they are now universally seen as the best builders of data centers, not just the most quickly, but running them the most efficiently on a dollar per token basis. It's a great economic proposition, therefore, to Anthropic and Google.
How did they end up with the data centers that other people want to rent?
Well, that's my point, is that they basically are like, okay, it isn't the best use of this compute capacity.
But how did they see 2-3 years ago that this was going to be in demand right now, whereas Anthropic...
Oh, they didn't see this 2 or 3 years ago. There's a reason we asked Professor Harvey why they did a filing amendment days before the listing on the deal with Google. I think they came to a very recent
just
decision.
The infrastructure, that would be necessary.
Elon Musk, in various examples, knew that it would be whoever bought the most chips. He did a post, I'll try and find it in the time we have left, where he said, step 1, buy chips, step 2, step 3, make lots of money. That's as simple as that. But in this case, it was very short term, where they were like, there's no point us running our own Grok models inference or training them in an aggregate cluster of the 3 data centers. It's tough for us to do it. We have these technical challenges. Let's make some money. And by the way, the way that the investors explained it to me is like they played a blinder with that. I mean, what a good idea. I'm paraphrasing, but the investors would say.
I do also think that with SpaceX, they are kind of playing to their strengths, right? So they kind of have recognize that building the infrastructure can be this lucrative business for them. And so they're thinking, okay, well, what can we do better than anyone else? That's launch rockets and build satellites. And so why not, make the infrastructure in space? I think it's just really smart for them.
Loren, before we let you go, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask about where this leaves Blue Origin right now.
Yeah.
Especially in the wake of that disaster just a few weeks ago on the launch pad.
It really was such unfortunate timing, from a competitive standpoint. Yes, so a couple weeks ago, a New Glenn rocket exploded very spectacularly during a test on a launch pad. And I think the fact that it exploded on the launch pad is probably the worst part, because it kind of obliterated that launch pad. And, the Blue Origin has come out and said that some parts are salvageable, other parts, definitely. We saw towers collapse. So they're in the midst of rebuilding that, but that launch pad infrastructure is just as, if not more important than the rocket sometimes, because they already have the other rockets in the queue, but they can't really launch, and they only had that one launch pad. So it really is, it took them out of commission for what could be a really long time.
Real quick, it was 9 months ago, Elon Musk, step 1, buy an expletive load of GPUs, step 2, step 3, profit, September 4th, 2025.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Hey, Loren.
It was October that he said we're going to do data center satellites, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whose idea it really was to do data centers in space. Was it Elon's? Was it someone else's? We'll never know.
Dun, dun, dun. Hey, Loren, just got a couple of minutes before we wrap up this hour. I mean, I'm looking at Rocket Lab down about 9.5%. Are there other names like we should be watching, or now at this point it's Elon's race to lose when it comes to space?
Yeah, I find that interesting, because the general theme,
they're not apples to apples, to be fair.
No, definitely not. But the general theme and consensus leading up to this IPO was that this was actually good for everybody in the space world. Yeah. I obviously took that with a little bit of a grain of salt, just because when it comes to competing with SpaceX, it's just been so difficult. I mean, look at Blue Origin, look at, and Blue Origin before that explosion was kind of poised to quote unquote beat SpaceX to the moon because they were about to launch their own lander in the fall. I just don't think that time frame is happening. It was going to be an uncrewed lander, but still, like, SpaceX hasn't actually landed anything on the moon.
They were getting very aggressive about it.
They were very aggressive about it, and it was very close to Jeff Bezos' heart because he's a moon guy. It's always been like Jeff Bezos, kind of the moon guy, Elon's the Mars guy. But when it comes to their New Glenn rocket being an actual competitor, they were just ramping up, and then look what happened. And then meanwhile, the other real option from a U.S. perspective is ULA's Vulcan rocket, also grounded because of issues, at least when it comes to the military. So it's just really hard to catch SpaceX on heavy lift launch specifically. Rocket Lab's in a different category with small launch, but they are building a new rocket to potentially compete with Falcon 9.